Welcome back, everyone, for another episode of Naked Without Shame. We're your hosts, Megan and Morgan, and today we will be joined by a friend of ours who is also very influenced by John Paul II's theology of the body, and we will be hearing her story coming up after this.
Open your hearts, open up your hearts to Christ. Do not be afraid.
Before we begin, we'd first like to invite you to download the Awaken app. The Awaken app is basically a social media alternative where you can speak with people, like-minded people, such as actually Megan and myself. You can talk with show hosts on there, and you can also get access to things like prayers. There's a shop, all sorts of cool features. So to download the Awaken app, go to theawakenapp.io.
We also want to invite you to consider joining our patronage membership. If you go to nakedwithoutshameshow.com, you'll get more details on how you can give and support our podcast.
Hi, everyone. If you're interested in going on a pilgrimage yet this year, you can visit selectinternationaltours.com/awaken.
Welcome, Julia. This is our dear friend, Julia Bolzon. I met Julia about 5 years ago at the John Paul II Institute, where Megan and I did a master's. And yeah.
Thank you.
Here she is.
Thanks for being here.
This is so cool. I'm really excited.
Yeah, it's good to have you in our studio. And so as Morgan was saying, we've known you for a little while now. You were starting the Ph.D. program at the John Paul II Institute when Morgan and I first arrived. So you were a little bit ahead of the game in that respect.
We looked up to you. We
did. Yeah. So we've gotten to know you over the years, but we just find you as a person very interesting, but also what you're doing with your life and your interest in particularly human life and bioethics. So we're just here to continue to hear about your story. So if you want to introduce yourself and just tell us about you.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you. So I'm doing my PhD at the John Paul II Institute. And first I started with the master's program. And the reason why I went there is because I was always interested in questions about human life. In high school is when it started. I had, a religion teacher that introduced us to questions about bioethics. I'd never even heard of what bioethics was. I never heard of that word before. And he had a lot of different units on life issues. So, for example, abortion. And I was a very naive young person. I never really heard of abortion before. Didn't know what it was. Things like embryonic stem cell research. Like I just, who knew, right? The word euthanasia. So this was obviously when I was in high school a long time ago. He made the joke that at the time, everyone thought the word euthanasia meant youth in Asia. And he would make that joke before. And we're kind of like, what is this word we've never heard of before? And I just, never really, all of these ways that human beings and human life were treated, maltreated, violated really struck me. I kind of thought like, why does this happen? It seemed like an injustice. And I was so, driven to understand. So that was in high school. And it was through that high school teacher, my religion teacher, that I wanted to pursue these questions about what does it mean to be human, right? Like and what does it mean to respect human life, to treat human life properly according to what we are. And also at the time in high school, just being taught about God and the fact that God exists and that, we believe we were made by God, right? And kind of like, what does that mean? And what does it mean that I was created by God and that I exist in this world? So I was really interested in that at a very deep level. And then,
you were raised Catholic?
Yes.
I know the
yeah.
answer to that question, but just for the sake of
Yeah, but okay, exactly. Raised Catholic, but never really like had those questions put to me. Like, what does it mean that I exist? Right? What does it mean that God exists? You know, like you believe it, but what, like, I guess tangibly speaking. Also, so this teacher, he taught in a very philosophical way, like Socratic way, like asking us questions that made us think. And I really just gravitated to that. Like, that was kind of where my desire to study philosophy was born. I think he really like drew it out of me.
Yeah, he created that space to like start philosophizing, like think about thinking really,
Yes.
and like deeper things, what things are for.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you're saying, in order to learn how to treat human life, like if we understand what life is, then we know how to care for it.
And
Yeah.
it's not just these rules, like the Catholic Church forbids abortion, gay marriage, all these things, but it's like based in like what you're saying, a view of the human person.
Yeah. Exactly. Like, why is it that, you know, it's wrong to take human life? Like, why? Yeah.
And especially you're growing up in Canada. I don't know if we mentioned that. Julia's Canadian.
Yes.
They can probably tell by my accent.
A little bit. Accent.
Yeah. Yeah.
But at least as I understand it, I don't know much about Canada, but the kind of sort of agendas and like sort of liberal ideologies are a little more advanced there. So like things like euthanasia or like gay marriage, like were kind of probably around the time, well, probably even before the time you were in high school, becoming like really prevalent.
Right.
But you were at a Catholic school, so it was kind of like maybe you didn't experience it so much in the culture.
I would say that these types of everything you're bringing up, I would never, it's not really spoken of in the sense that being pro-life and the way that pro-life in America is so different. It's very quiet. Like, it's almost like a non-existent, I shouldn't say that. Not that it's a non-existent movement. It's just not so public.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting.
Because religion and morality and all that sort of thing is it's in the private sphere. It's not in your face. It's not in the public square. So I think that's why with my high school teacher getting me to think about those things, I was kind of like, why are these not more discussed? You know, why is this my first time thinking about these things?
Yeah. And so that then led you to kind of want to devote like your work to that, or kind of your way of, study, like the study that you chose, and learning more about bioethics. So can you explain maybe to our listeners what bioethics is, basically?
Okay. So, let's see. So in university, in undergrad, I wanted to study philosophy, and because I wanted to pursue bioethics. But there was only 2 bioethics classes. One was called Moral Issues, and then the other was Advanced Bioethics, and they're like upper year philosophy classes. So you have to like take philosophy to get to them, right? Wait, what was the first question?
The first question was, what is bioethics?
Okay.
Yes.
So I wanted to study bioethics because I was interested in how ought we to treat human life. And I always understood bioethics as this subject looking at how life is treated in the realm of the life sciences, health, medicine, that sort of thing. When I began to study bioethics for research for my dissertation, like, I learned a lot more about what is this discipline, what does the word mean. It's a lot broader than I initially thought. But yeah, essentially trying to understand what is human life, and then how ought it to be treated.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. So like when we think of bioethics, we can kind of think of like these life issues, like you were saying, like abortion, genetic engineering, and
Right. Okay.
and these kind of controversial or ethical topics that Catholics in particular like have a stance on. But then there's this principle of bioethics, or this subject of bioethics, that helps expand like why like we maybe have a stance on certain like life issues. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too, because I think as like technology in particular becomes more and more advanced and is able to kind of impress itself or influence human life, we face these issues, you know, of abortion or of genetic engineering and things like bioethics kind of becomes necessary when we start to maybe alter or change or influence the human life, the body, you know?
Yeah, we have like capabilities to do like absolutely crazy things now. But the question is like, should we do them just because we're capable of doing them? And like, is this sort of like progress mentality that's like a very common, widespread, I don't know, understanding in the past, like, I don't know, 500 years? Like, is that good? Like, or how should we understand that? How should we kind of keep that in check? Basically.
Exactly.
So that's actually that's how bioethics as this new discipline emerged, because with all these new technological abilities, some examples would be organ donation, right? Or like the invention of the ventilators, like was able to prolong life, right? So all of these new abilities and new powers. At the same time, a lot of scientists and doctors were asking the question, like, you know, is this right that we do this? Like, you know, should we be doing this? Like, how do we know? Basically, how do we know, you know, when too far is too far?
What's our measure? I think that's like a really difficult question.
And I get, sorry, just to add one more thing is that bioethics, that term or that subject of study, it originated in the 60s and 70s as a new field. And even today, I just want to say that it's often a very secular subject, right? So often it's spoken of or dealt with, or the way that we should treat human life is done in such a way that excludes questions of religion or theology or God, because we live in a, you know, pluralistic, right, society. And so any speaking about the human being, the thought is that, well, we can't speak of, you know, religious matters because we live in a pluralistic society. Not everybody agrees about religion or morality, for example. So that's why I found it so difficult also to study bioethics, because I thought, well, what about creation, right? Like, what about our relationship with God? Like, what does that have to do with what it means to be human? So there's always that kind of, what's the word? Conflict, maybe, that is what led me to study more. Especially from within a Catholic worldview, I thought, how can we articulate and defend what it means to be human in a reasonable way that anyone can understand, regardless of religion, right? Like, is there something to our humanness that, like, applies, you know, regardless of your beliefs, for example?
Interesting. Yeah. So you're saying, like, what you're interested is not just like a Catholic. I mean, it is obviously very influenced by Catholic teachings and a Catholic worldview, but you're saying it's like what you want to do with bioethics is not like specifically Catholic, like it's just human.
Yeah. And so okay, for example, like, I'm really interested in the meaning of artificial reproductive technologies. I don't know if you've talked about that on your show.
No, we haven't. Very interesting.
That's a really, wow. I mean, all these subjects are so sensitive because they're so normal in society today, right? So even to speak about, like, in vitro fertilization, like, a lot of us know people that's how they were conceived, right? But so my question would be, what does it mean that we're born into the world, right? What does it mean that we come from a mother and a father? What does it mean that some of us now don't come from, like, a natural union between a man and a woman, right? That we were created outside the womb or brought into being outside the womb. So yeah, and I'm also, like, really interested in philosophical, like, existential perspective. So
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's great. So tell us a little bit about what you're writing on.
Okay. So what I'm writing on is always sort of been this question that I had since high school, right? What does it mean, so bioethics and the human person, right? What does it mean to be a human person? And then how do we let that understanding help us think about what it means to treat human beings? So from my studies at the Institute, we read a lot of different philosophers, and one of them is a German Jewish philosopher named Hans Jonas that you guys would know of. He's a very little known philosopher, but this 20th century, so he fought in World War II, and then he emigrated to America and lived in New York for the rest of his life. He was really interested in the question of being alive, and what does it mean to be a living being, an organism? What is aliveness, and what's the relationship between human being and then the rest of other living beings? So I was exposed to his work, and he has such a very a rich philosophical and metaphysical perspective on being. So I don't know if you've talked about metaphysics is.
We've talked around it. I don't know if we've used that word, metaphysics. Mm-hmm. How would we describe metaphysics?
Okay, I would say the study of what things are.
Yeah.
But I know people use it in different ways, and the technical definition. But so for me, it's the study of being, of what things are.
Mm-hmm. Being and existing.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm applying his thought to bioethics because, as I said, he emigrated to America. So he's German born, lived in New York during the 60s and 70s when all of these questions of medicine, science, technology were really in the air. And he was actually involved in the founding of one of the first centers of bioethics called the Hastings Center. So I find his thought is so, he was there at the time when all these questions were in the air. And so he applied his thinking about the living being to bioethical questions. So what I'm doing is kind of mining his thought for what did he say? How is it helpful to our understanding of the living being? And how can that help us in our thinking about bioethics today? So,
very interesting.
Yeah.
So you're saying he's not Catholic.
Right.
But you would kind of agree with his, we're saying metaphysical assumptions, like his assumptions about what reality is, what being is. That's interesting to me that you'd say that like you relate to him, or you think that it's helpful for your own kind of very Catholic.
That's a really, really good point. Because, exactly. That, why am I using a non-Catholic thinker? And that's exactly why, is because he's asking the question of being. And I think he comes to some really good... Also, he brings out things that weren't seen before. So, for example, his... he helps to show where did our conception of being come from? What are the origins? And by that, I mean, we often view the human being in a dualistic way. Have you talked about dualism? Is this too much?
No, I mean, I think this is, we don't use the word dualism, but we talk about it all the time.
Okay.
The separation between body and soul, body and spirit.
Exactly. Yeah. Body, the material, and then the spiritual or immaterial. So the mind, for example, or the spirit. So he wants to show why is it that, in our 20th century society, like in his time and ours, why do we have such a dualistic conception as if our mind and our person, our I, like my being, as if it's separate from my body, right? That what and who I am is just my mind and I have this body.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so our body is just like this material thing, a part of us, but not who we are, right? And the reason why he was looking at that is because of this question of brain death. Is this getting into too much?
No, it's great.
Keep going.
So in the 60s, this new thing called brain death emerged, which was essentially severely injured patient, so the severe, catastrophic brain injury. So they were in a coma. They were comatose. Being comatose was also a new condition because the ventilator was a new invention. So you previously could not keep people alive, right? If you had a severe brain injury, you would progress to death. eventually your heart's going to shut down because you can't breathe anymore because your brainstem controls respiration. So there was a new proposal to change what it means to be dead from a cardiopulmonary definition to a brain-based definition, meaning that if your heart is still beating, but your brain is no longer active or functioning fully, like, they call it whole brain death, that essentially you would be dead.
Interesting.
Even though your heart is still beating with the help of a ventilator, right? So you're respiring. Respiration is still occurring. So Hans Jonas was involved in like thinking through the implications of that new definition. And he was just sort of like, why would we call somebody dead who's still animated? Right? That it doesn't make sense. And so he called it a sort of reemergence of this dualism between body and soul that in our time is a brain-body dualism. And him as a philosopher, he wanted to show that this can actually be traced back to the 16th and 17th century. So the birth of modern science and modern philosophy and a new way of thinking about reality. So he wanted to show, okay, where did this dualism at the end of the 20th century, where can it be traced back to? So how can we understand why is it that we think this way? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because in order to get to where we are with, like you're saying, changing what death is to being at the level of the brain, it came from like a thought that has been evolving, that has created the understanding of the science and the technologies to then be able to have the ventilator, to have this life issue, this question, right? And in redefining what life is and what death is. So it comes from like a trace of thought that's emerged.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And also that, for example, things like the invention of the ventilator, like all of these life-saving technologies, they're good, right? I mean, they were created for a good purpose, like for a good thing. But no one would have ever thought, right, how does this change how we think about the human being, what it means to be alive? Not just in thought, like not just in theory, but then in practice.
Yeah.
So it created new practices that never before existed that now we have to deal with.
That's so interesting.
Ethically, right? Yeah. Never before was it possible to keep a comatose person alive.
That's so interesting. And so that like separation that you're talking about between like being alive and then brain death.
Yeah.
That like goes on to influence like other issues, basically. I mean, like I just thought of like the case of maybe I'm getting this wrong, but like Terri Schiavo, is that similar? Like, or would you say it's influenced at least by this like discussion of brain death?
Okay, thank you for bringing that up. So actually the reason why I'm in the States because I don't know if this is good on air, but the border's closed. I'm here because I went to a conference. I don't know if you have to take that out. No, this is legal.
Legal.
I went to a conference this past weekend on moral theology, and the main speaker was this Professor Charlie Camosi, who just wrote a book called Losing Our Dignity, which I would recommend this book because it was actually fantastic. I listened to the audiobook and heard him speak. He wants to show why is it that in contemporary society that human beings who've lost their mental capacity, their ability to think, whether in embryonic life, so beginning of life, right before our ability to think is really formed, or at the end of life, either brain dead patients or people in vegetative states like Terri Schiavo. He wants to show that why is it that we view them as worthless or kind of gone, right? Because they're no longer fully present or aware. Almost, the separation between person and human being. So a lot of people might say that Terri Schiavo as a person no longer exists, right? That she died.
Because she can't cognitively function.
Exactly.
Anymore?
And she's, minimally responsive. So, okay, the Terri Schiavo, okay, the reason why I bring up this book is because he goes through the details and her story in a lot more detail that I think is really important to know, right? Like, who was she?
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Could you maybe explain who she is for those of you who don't, who are listening don't know who she is? Yeah.
I hope I do this justice. That's why I bring up his book, because he explains it really well. But Terri was a young woman who, I believe she had a stroke in her early 20s, like a really bad stroke that left her, not able to use her full mental capacity. So in what was then called a persistent vegetative state.
Okay.
So at the time, what science knew about that condition, they labeled it this vegetative state. In the sense that her rational capacities weren't fully there. So Terri was still awake. She couldn't speak, right? She could eat. She could respond to you, right? She was aware, but her response was limited.
But her body was functioning.
Yeah, her body. Yeah. So, for example, she did not need a ventilator. She did not need a ventilator, right?
Yeah. Okay.
And so the controversy there was that, what was the value or the worth? Not worth isn't. Was her life meaningful to her to be alive in that condition?
And was she still herself? Kind of like you were saying before, like was she still Terri Schiavo?
Right. Even though she's mentally different. So I forget the initial question, but I was so glad that you brought that up. Dang.
Well, just the connection between that and brain death. Like I was kind of surmising that like potentially the separation between like being physically alive and like the brain death definition of death or aliveness, like that could potentially lead to us saying, well, actually, it's not just if someone's brain dead, it's if someone stops functioning cognitively, that we could say that they basically...
They're not alive.
They're not alive anymore.
Human.
They're not who they are anymore. And so they're not, they're not alive.
Yeah.
I mean, and all sorts of other issues. I mean, with euthanasia, I feel like it's also like different, but like potentially related.
Or
like,
dementia. Yeah. So that's what made me think of Charlie Camosi's book. It's called Losing Our Dignity. we got to look at it because he draws those parallels and he shows exactly that point.
Wow, that's really interesting.
And he also draws from new research by a neurologist who's also a bioethicist, Joseph Fins, who explains that our understanding of this vegetative state has changed and grown, and that in the 90s, so this Terri Schiavo, this happened in the 90s, and she died in 2005. So it's relatively recent. Like that's,
I remember it being on the news when I was a kid.
Yeah. That what we once thought, that people in that condition were completely, unresponsive, unaware, that actually with all these new ability, to do brain scans, right, to measure the level of activity, that they actually were much more aware than what was thought at the time. So there's actually, a lot of tragic consequences of that.
That's
people
crazy.
left to be vegetables, right? Not interacted with simply because we thought that they weren't all there.
Interesting.
Right.
Maybe they understood more than they were able to communicate. Basically.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so the whole this I find so fascinating, but the relationship between our minds and our brains and our bodies is so mysterious and so not little known, but there's so much to learn about it that we shouldn't presume to think or to know more than we actually do, because
we can take our
consciousness
tools and measure whether
is
someone's
mysterious.
alive.
Yeah. Like you can't. How can you measure that physically?
Interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Good.
And as you're talking, it just makes me once again believe in the reality that the body matters so much, and that we are a part of the body, or we are a body. We are our bodies. It's not like we have a body, right?
Yes, that is key. That is key. No, that is so key. Exactly that. That like, I couldn't have said it. Yeah, I don't know who said that initially, right? That we are our bodies.
Yeah.
Right. Like who we are is not just me, Julia, inhabiting a body, right? But like who I am is this union of the immaterial with the physical body.
Yeah. And if I can remember correctly from studying a little bit of Hans Jonas too at the John Paul II Institute, he emphasizes that like life is actually a lot about like metabolism and just the real biological functions of life that allow it to survive, like kind of foundationally, right? So he emphasizes things like, metabolizing and I don't know, you could probably add more, but.
So that's, okay, yeah, that's a good, interesting thing you bring up. So it's this question of what does it mean to be a living thing in comparison to a dead thing or a non-living thing, right? So think of a rock, then think of a plant, think of an insect, and then think of a computer, right? So like what's the difference in the being of all of those things? And so Hans Jonas wanted to show that what uniquely characterizes living things is metabolism, meaning this exchange of matter between their, like the, I guess what do you call it, their body and the external environment. And to show that that exchange is a self-initiated thing, right? So the insect or a plant, right, a living being, has this fundamental and ongoing exchange that is what keeps it alive. But that, for example, even a plant, like photosynthesis, like the plant has the ability to do that of its own accord. So it's not like a machine in the sense that someone has to turn the machine on in order for it to like be running. You know, so that aliveness and metabolism is this autonomous or self or intrinsic to that being. Whereas a machine, the machine's functioning is extrinsic, meaning that something outside of the machine, well, first of all, builds it, but also has to initiate its motion or its movement.
So interesting. Yeah, those are good thoughts. Yeah, awesome. Okay, well, before we wrap...
Sorry, I was getting really excited.
No, that's so great. You have a lot of knowledge to share. So,
super interesting stuff. I wish we could go more into it.
I know we could. We should. But to maybe wrap up, did you have a thought, Morgan?
I guess I just want to like really quickly close because I feel like we opened all this stuff in this discussion and we didn't like actually draw any conclusions. Well, we alluded to conclusions.
Yeah.
But like what would you say is like death? Like what is a true death? Because we're talking about how brain death assumes this dualistic separation between the body and soul. So like how should we look at death? I don't know.
So, so death is, how do we understand it, right? So the separation of the soul from the body, biologically speaking. So there's different ways of, right, at what sort of level. So metaphysically speaking. And the reason why this relates to the aliveness is, okay, no, I need to backtrack, but just, so the soul is the living principle, right? So the reason why we say death is the separation of soul from body is because without the animating principle, that's sort of what death is. And then there's a disintegration because the principle of animation is no longer there. So I will stop metabolizing once I cease to be alive. Because the internal motion or like the impetus of being alive is gone. Biologically speaking, what we look for are signs that death has occurred. Okay. So, for example, the cessation of heartbeat is a sign that the animating principle is no longer there because what was once almost keeping you alive is now gone. So biologically speaking, we look for signs that death has occurred. Okay. Does that help at all?
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely.
Definitely. So
Yeah.
it's not this like sort of like, I declare you dead because you're not thinking anymore,
Right. So
or you're not
So
who you were anymore.
right. So that definition of death is based on our assumption that what it means to be alive is to be able to think, is, you know, that sort of personhood definition.
Right.
I am
Right.
my brain, for example.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So good.
Very interesting.
I like that. Thank you so much, Julia, for being on our show today.
For having me.
All the way from Canada.
International.
Yeah, we appreciate you coming and stopping in and just sharing your knowledge on your topic of bioethics. And we look forward to hearing more about your studies and like what you're learning too. So,
Great.
Yep.
yeah. So,
Thanks for having me.
absolutely. All right, everybody. Thanks for listening in. We will see you next time.